We are told by Christian polls and studies that somewhere over 90% of all Christians live by the law or some form of law. You see, law is easy for us to understand. We live in a culture that has so many laws, we can't even count them all. A U.S. Supreme Court judge recently said that we now have 10 million laws to enforce the 10 Commandments. Today we become more sophisticated, and we don't say we live by law, but by perhaps principles, precepts, standards, methods, formulas, things like that. They sound less demanding, but they are still the nature of living by some form of law. We begin with a premise that we obey or put into practice in our lives. This is living by law. Now, Paul says even those of us who are not under the law and subject to it are so legal-minded that we tend to create our own laws. We invent our own laws. Isn't that crazy? We like to know if we're winning or losing, and it seems that living by law is at least one way to calculate a win-lose score in life. How good are we doing, or how good are we not doing? Jesus says that the law was not meant to exist forever. It was only meant to exist until John the Baptist. And John died before Jesus did. Now, Jesus and John lived at the same time. They were cousins. So at the time of the death of Jesus, there was no longer any of God's law at all that was in force. It was retired. Paul says it was abolished. Paul, of course, agrees with Jesus, but he puts it a little bit differently in the book of Galatians. He says that the law was only meant to exist until the seed came. Now, the seed, he explains in chapter 3, was Jesus. So he says the same thing, just in a different way. Now, didn't both Jesus and John the Baptist die 2,000 years ago? If this is the case, then the law should have been set aside 2,000 years ago, right? The intent of these sessions on the law is to show that none of us should be living by the Old Testament law of God. And also, how many times it says this. We're told this a lot. Paul says that if we want to live unto God, we must be dead to the law. That's very specific. This cannot be misinterpreted. It's either or. It cannot be both and. Either live for God or live for the law.